All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Rob Catalano, and welcome to WorkTango's webinar series for the September 2020. We have a number of folks that are continuing to join right now, and looking at the chat, there's people from all over. We got Vermont, Columbus, Toronto, Chicago, Seattle, San Diego, Tacoma, loving it. We got people from far and wide, and we love when the WorkTango community spreads across that world. So Halifax as well, amazing. Just by introduction, my name is Rob Catalano, Chief Engagement Officer at WorkTango, and I, along with a big team at WorkTango, support putting together these webinars to really just support education and inspiration for our leadership, business, and HR community. And we do these every so often to really just dig into experts in the space and hear their thoughts around important topics that are happening in the workplace. So I'm excited, as always, to have these sessions, and especially a topic today that is near and dear to my heart and what I do every day, and what I support from a continuous listening perspective with WorkTango. But we want to talk a little more specific today is about replacing top-down change management with continuous listening. So again, how do we engage employees in more an agile and participative workplace culture? I do want to introduce Pauline James. Thank you for being here. Pauline is the principal at Anchor HR Services, and what's great, I mean, I love companies that have very, very specific missions, and her team's mission is to assist new, growing, and under-resourced organizations with implementing solutions required to drive a great employee experience and business results. And I love when it starts with employee experience, because it's not until you get that right till you start seeing those business results. And their area of expertise is building a purpose-oriented culture that's participative, evidence-based, and forward-focused. And prior to launching Anchor HR, Pauline has held a number of senior positions in large organizations such as Sun Life, Shoppers Drug Mart, American Express. But she has supported small independent units, large complex divisions, and really identifying barriers to employee engagement and really helping them build effective and sustainable programs tailored to their needs. So, I love when people come in with a mindset of seeing other organizations, not just their own. You've kind of done it all, Pauline. So I want to, the screen is yours, and I'm really excited to have you here today. So thank you so much.
So pleased to be here. Really looking forward to our discussion. So today I want to spend this time with you to talk through both effective practices for change management, and also how do we build a culture that's primed for change, primed to be agile. So we're going to talk through common change frameworks, what we recommend. If we have time, we'll spend some time talking through employee communication practices as well, more where we most often see key missteps and where we suggest you focus from a strategic perspective, and most importantly, that Q&A. So as Rob said, yes, he absolutely needs to interrupt me and engage during the discussion. So I like to say good advice needs great context. So look forward to that, and I really look forward to having time to interact at the end of our time together today. So prior to our new unusual world with the pandemic earlier this year, many of us are in conversations, talked about being in a VUCA world, a VUCA environment. We had coaching, leadership seminars to prepare leaders and organizations to deal with a world and an environment that's increasingly complex. And then COVID happened and layered on a whole new level of unexpected complexity and disruption. Any organization that predicted the kinds of decisions they would be facing in March of this year and would have been prepared to think about how do we move our entire offer online? How do we move our workforce remote? How do we engage and upgrade our retail space so it allows for distancing and protections for staff and customers? And we also saw an incredible amount of resilience and organizations adapting to changes incredibly swiftly and effectively. And in many cases, we actually saw engagement increase with employees, appreciating the fact that they've been involved in these endeavors. And with that, we also heard conversation around, well, can't we always move this quickly? Is change management dead, right? Can we get rid of a lot of this fluff? Can we always move with this amount of speed? And my response would be, yes, sure. If you make sure that you have a shared context that all employees are working from. You have agreement on the need to adapt. You're aligned on your key objectives, and you're allowing employees to meaningfully participate in an environment of trust. So it suggests that, our question is, how do we replicate that environment, that culture, in a more ongoing basis? Because I'm certain we don't want to replicate the pandemic. That's not something we're looking to repeat. That's something we're looking forward to being able to move past at some juncture. But we do want to maintain the gains that we gained around agility and speed in many organizations. To be an organization that's effective, to be a team that's effective, we need to be adept at adapting. We're going to continue to see competition, technology, markets evolve. So when we look at change management, most of us likely have a model that we rely on, our organizations rely on, that we're comfortable with. I think most organizations are fairly sophisticated around how we do change management. We often see that you've got your market indicators, you have your performance indicators, you have skilled teams internally to identify where improvements can be made. The change management plan, it's thought through. The concept, the need for change is thought through, it's thoughtful. But it is designed generally at the top. Progressive organizations will engage stakeholders and key stakeholders for input. A detailed plan is often developed, and in more progressive organizations, that will include the communications that need to flow at each juncture, who needs to be informed of what, and primarily hierarchical implementation. And again, more progressive organizations will often have ambassadors that they bring along earlier to help their teams move forward. What are the gaps with the common approach? We're often not going as deep as we could to gain those insights from our organization as a whole, from those who are primarily responsible for implementing products, selling services, interacting with customers. We're not always as connected to or identifying the connections between departments and the contacts that employees have, how our systems within our organization are often interconnected, and people are interconnected in often ways that we don't anticipate and we won't see until things are already implemented or we've seen issues arise. And the change isn't always clearly attached to the purpose of what we're trying to accomplish. And when it is very, very detailed, well thought out plan, but it's not connected to the milestones and what we're trying to achieve, we can end up off track and very attached to an implementation and a timeline without continuing to check that we're not implementing anything with unforeseen consequences. So what do we suggest improving? Leveraging frontline insights, and this really being a continuous conversation where we are tapping into the incredible wealth of knowledge that our frontline employees have. And frontline here too, those that are implementing, accessing, delivering any product or service at any level in the organization. And this comes back to that shared context. So with COVID, we had this shared reality. Everyone saw what had happened and appreciated the need and had a real desire to support the organization to move online, to be able to move from home. But how do we recreate that generally? Rather than a detailed task list, suggests that we're more focused on agility, that we are focused on outcomes. We're focused on our passion, our purpose, what our goals are. And hierarchical implementation is replaced with meaningful participation. So let's spend some time digging deeper into these three areas. And the key premise is that we are treating employees as trusted advisors. And there's been great research on this. David Horsiger has done some great work around the efficiency of trust in organizations. And we know that we garner efficiency and agility when employees are engaged and meaningfully involved, when we have tapped into their insights around barriers, when they feel heard, when they are participating in the solutions and helping us refine and making sure that we are delivering and they are involved in delivering an incredibly high standard of service. Common pitfall, again, is that we're not tapping into the depth that we need to with our teams. to ensure that we are all operating from the same and common understanding. And often would say, when we look at this from a cultural perspective, it's often that we're not sharing as often as we can, as clearly as we can, how we're doing as a business, what our key objectives are, but even as importantly, what our key metrics are telling us, that we're sharing that customer feedback with our employees, and then we're also tapping into what they are seeing and hearing as they work on our products, as they service customers. And when we're implementing change to address gaps we've identified, I've seen often where we haven't tested the tactics with the employees. We may have had a small sample, but we haven't accurately ensured that what we're introducing is actually going to solve what the issue is at the crux of the gap that we've identified. It's an organization some time ago, and they had implemented a series of changes, invested significantly, and were frustrated by the lack of traction, that engagement hadn't moved, employees were still frustrated. And as it turned out, there were issues with how it had been structured, the language that was used for ordering, for procurement up to frontline didn't match the language that employees used at front end. So despite all of these intentions and great intentions to reduce the need for errors, reduce the incidence of the wrong part arriving, the wrong shipment arriving for a customer, the intended impact was not realized. And lesson from COVID was we had this community of change that allowed the speed. We had to go back to that shared context and a shared agreement for the need to adapt. And we want deeper engagement with our employees at all levels. We want to make sure that we are in tune with their sentiment at each point in time, let alone when we begin a change initiative. We're tapping into their insights. We are involving them in problem solving, and we're considering when we need to co-create or when we can co-create, that's ideal, when we can collaborate, and when we need cooperation. And the reality is there are times where we need cooperation, right? We know what we need to do, we need to move quickly, but we'll suggest that employees will cooperate with us when we've established goodwill, which we'll talk a little bit more about. Focus and agility.
I wanted to actually just interrupt and give some context to that. One, there's a little bit of research out there that talks about there's two types of employee voice. And it really resonated with me where it said, when we think about getting feedback from employees in these initiatives, we think about one type of employee voice, which is called satisfaction and dissatisfaction. Are you happy with this change or are you not? And it's pretty binary. But the second one, which is what's called participative management, is now, okay, well, why? What would you do differently? How would you recommend this? And all those things you had on that list, it comes from asking the right questions. And again, I come from more of a lens of the employee survey kind of assessment type world, but that's where I think a lot of the pitfalls you mentioned and fail is like, we're just asking them how they feel. We're not asking them why they feel that way or what they would do differently. So I found that was a good way for me to kind of delineate what I should be asking versus what I shouldn't be in these types of initiatives.
Very good, absolutely. And I just love the call out there on the importance of going deeper and actively assessing the real friction points for employees. And we often need to roll up our sleeves and be willing to get into the details. That what matters for them is the fact that it takes 3 extra steps, right, to get between the scoop machine to the cash register and the impact on them. And that's how we build trust and show we care. And it's actually one of the primary ways we drive efficiency.
And they want to be involved, right? There's a joy in being involved in making change at the end of the day.
It's a basic human need for involvement. Mm-hmm. And I think, too, in reality as well, is those of us who drive the change and are closest to it often have access to the best information. We have the most time to consider the inputs and control over what the outcome looks like. And control and time are key antecedents to how well we're willing to embrace change. And we can also trick ourselves into thinking how brilliant it is that we came up with this solution or this idea. But the reality is we have access to better insights. And the power of sharing those insights more broadly within the organization is phenomenal. Let alone the motivation you're speaking of the difference when you are actively engaged in problem solving and what that means for your level of energy and the efforts you're willing to go to support the organization's passion, mission.
Awesome. See, she has no issues with me interrupting, so if you have questions, throw them in the Q&A.
Yes, please. I like talking to Rob, but I would prefer if it's more interactive as well. Goals are more inspiring and enabling than tactics. So this comes back to, we talked to, can we always move at this speed? Well, yes, if we're, again, shared context, shared agreement that we need to adapt, shared understanding and alignment on our key objectives. So with that, we want to absolutely define what the outcome we're looking for. But we get much more traction when we identify the milestone, the outcome that we're looking for, rather than a clearly delineated list. Work with an organization where everything was so described, and PMO offices, and the nature of their work is there's lots of change, lots of technological change to support service. And in speaking with the employees, they were so incredibly frustrated because once a project began, it felt like they were on a train track, right, in the wrong direction. And there was no opportunity to course correct. But wait, we're actually not going to get what I was told that our objective is here. Wait, we might get this done, but we're actually going to completely mess up this other component and this other division if we continue. And there wasn't an appropriate level of opportunity to define, redefine. And the other reality is that we are often very attached to our own ideas and our own work, especially if it's been labor intensive, right? We're even more attached than merited. So it allows us all to be more flexible and agile if we keep our mind more on the prize, what's our ultimate goal here, and making sure that we are actively measuring ROI and input along the journey. Lessons from COVID, again, we were able to move quickly because we were aligned on key objectives. I'm sorry, Rob. I'm having troubles driving today, clearly. Another sip of coffee, get back on the road. So we're looking at, a recommendation is defining success metrics, measuring ROI, building in milestones with feedback loops to course correct, celebrating implementation and milestones. And I'll call it, that's deliberately worded in that way, that it's implementation and then milestones, because we want one of our milestones to be post-implementation to make sure we are measuring whether we achieve the intended impact that we were looking for. We're assessing if there's been unintended consequences. And then thirdly, meaningful participation. The most motivated teams, they're aware of the challenges and opportunities, they tackle them together. I'm always so impressed when we do active listening, focus groups, and go deep into a unit. And most often the employees are incredible as far as their commitment to work, their business acumen, and how they are hungry to understand much more about how the business is actually doing, what the reasons behind decisions are. Employee sentiment to the workplace is often a reaction of how supported they feel in their work and their opportunity to contribute and connect, which, Rob, goes back to your point about the importance of feeling that they are actively included in problem solving and actively involved. And from COVID, we saw that companies were in a place where they couldn't Google and look up, what did other companies do in this situation, right? They were completely dependent upon their employees and needed to trust them. Yes, you've gone home, right? Here's what we need to achieve. And the number of leaders I've spoken with at all levels of the organization that are so proud of the work that their teams accomplished during this time. Impressed and proud, which I think also shows us just the difference it makes when we share the context, when we allow people to participate, when they have the same information as us, when they're trusted advisors, the impact that they can have for themselves and for their teams. So again, this is just about going much deeper. And we talked about goodwill with teams and organizations. And again, that's how we build it, is by making sure that we are also clearly focused on what slows them down, what prevents them from doing good work each day. had some organizations we work with where I'll say that our team actually went back and double checked some of the data. The organization had implemented wage cuts across the board, with the exception of a division that was responsible and for frontline service and needed to be in for some deliveries as a small unit within the business. And they were staggered, with those that were higher income earners taking deeper cuts than those down to the more entry-level positions. And the sentiment from the employees was so high afterwards, and they were so proud of how the organization worked together to make sure that the impact was minimized for all employees, to the point that the employees who weren't impacted actually put their hands to say, but we feel like we should take a cut too. So we think about, yes, they had the context of COVID to work from, but they also had built up so much goodwill within this organization by how interconnected the teams were, how well aware they were of how each group functioned together, and the efforts they'd made up to this point in time to make sure that when changes were happening within the organization, employees were actively involved and included. It's like any, sorry?
Oh, sorry, go on.
You know, it's like any relationship, right? Whether we have goodwill, and there's times where we just want cooperation. And I'm sure we all have people in our lives that if they showed up and made a bizarre request, be okay, right? But I'll help you out. You need me to rush over to your house and we're going to put all your living room furniture outside. Okay, I'll be looking for an explanation later, but okay, I'll cooperate. And it's the same within organizations. We build the goodwill, and we have an agile organization by making sure we have those great practices of remaining very well in tune with the barriers at the front line.
Right. And I thought, because we're talking about meaningful participation, it was a really good question that just came up. It said, how do you ensure getting feedback does not become an opportunity to complain and whine? That it's objective, it's rational, it's constructive. See if you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's often a concern, right? If we want to open Pandora's box and have, a wine fest, I will say that the key sign of engagement is volunteerism. And employees identifying barriers to their job, which can sound a whole lot like complaints, is volunteerism. And while it can be a little hard to hear at times, when we turn that into insights that can be actioned, we build trust with employees. They tend to also become more focused on solutions, and it becomes this kind of virtuous cycle of engagement. So I would be much more concerned about dampening the very candid feedback than finding ways to encourage people to be solution-oriented from the beginning. People have a fundamental need for attention and to be heard. And if we're not feeling heard in one way, we are more likely to complain and to be agitated. And I think we have to engage in that active listening exercise before we can shift the conversation to, okay, let's partner on solutions. I have yet to see someone become more wound up by being heard.
Yeah. And just I get this a lot kind of in my industry and day to day, it's maybe some additional color. I've seen this tackled in two ways. One is if it is just simple, getting feedback through survey mechanisms, that's why there's design of questions and science around the right way to ask questions to not lead them to, the complaint world, but more of that participative management side as well. And then the other one, in terms of conversations, I've seen organizations structure it kind of like a concept like brutal facts from good to great, where it's like, let us know what the brutal fact is. Here's your opportunity to whine on what's not working well. Well, now we're going to take all that, curate it as a group, and identify what are the most important priorities. And now the conversation's about what that issue was, but how are we going to fix it? You kind of lead the conversation, not to the whining stage, but to being constructive and rational and trying to help support action. So sometimes having both conversations, the first one will lead you to a more successful one on what do we do about this. But those are two I've seen used in my past as well.
Very good. I think you've outlined it well, right? We hear the sentiment, and then we want to engage the employees on how we channel this to solutions.
Thanks for that question, Patricia.
When we're filtering feedback within the organization, we want to make sure we are accounting for the influence of power and bias. And we talked about control and time as amplifiers, right? For people to be willing to adapt. And those at the most senior level tend to have much more access to control and time. And I would suggest we kind of look at that, the continuum. The less control somebody has, the more time it's going to take them to adjust. And I've absolutely been in situations where we couldn't even tell leaders what was happening based on the confidentiality until the announcement came. But in those cases, we invested even more in taking care of them on the back end and increasing their comfort level. We would have actually saved a whole lot more time, which is what we're talking about today, if we'd engaged them up front, but we need to account for it within that model. People do tend to please upward. Leaders filter what's relevant to them. And this is not intentional. There's no ill will behind this. But we're human, and we filter things that we can relate most closely to, that reflect our own thoughts and perspective. Work within a large organization, we had a phenomenal amount of risk after a rollout of a change in benefits and operations. And we had an enormous amount of employees suddenly going outside the organization for support, more complaints, more attendance issues in certain areas, a lot more escalations. And in digging deeper, you have the leaders say, well, what do you expect? You change this, this, and this. But when we got to the employee level and the units that are most at risk, they had a very different refrain. They weren't impacted the same way their leaders were. But the leaders were suffering themselves, right? They hadn't adapted to the change. They hadn't bought in. They weren't on the bus at all. But the employees at the front line were actually quite upset about the fact that they felt things didn't matter. Their input didn't matter. There were basic operational challenges that weren't being addressed. So as much as it's incredibly important that we engage leaders, enable leaders, it's fundamental. We also need to make sure we have different avenues to tap into employee input as well. And being within larger organizations and having access to the amount of data I did in my career, I learned some things that surprised me. And one of them was the fact that the units at risk weren't always the ones I would have immediately identified. In that if engagement, was great, leadership, great, performance enablement, okay, we're very strong. Absolutely. That did hold true. If engagement was pretty good, right, leadership pretty good, performance enablement, we're likely okay. If they're very low, it's likely a 911 situation. Absolutely. What surprised me was we could actually have engagement that's a little better. We look at Team C and Team B. But when the leadership was rated much higher and there was a gap there, those were units where we're seeing an incredible amount of escalations and issues, attendance, performance, labor board inquiries. And we went into the units and did a deeper dive. What we hear is, my leader's great, she's a great gal, he's a great guy, not her fault, not his fault, their hands are tied. The company has forced them to make this change and impose it upon us. And what happened was, the employees' trust in the organization was eroded. Their buy-in for the need for change was eroded, and they also didn't feel their leaders could be effective advocates for them. So again, it just comes back to ensuring we've got that leader enablement in place, and we're ensuring that we're really tapping into those frontline insights. HR's role within this, ensuring we have practical support and structure that allows for those multiple avenues for input and involvement. We're equipping leaders to be responsive, and that goes beyond the implementation, right? We want to engage, we want to make sure they're not seeing the memo at the same time as their employees. They haven't had time to adapt, they haven't had time to grieve maybe, or right, to wrap their head around the change, to get on the same page. But we also don't want them avoiding the employees once it's rolled out, right? Like, oh, it looks like the waters are calm, I'm just going to hide over here and not stir it up. We actually want them going out. We don't want sentiment that's under the surface. And go back to our conversation earlier, if we don't let people get out what's on their mind, they tend to ruminate and fester. We want to make sure we're surfacing all of this, which means we owe those leaders support to respond. And this may be controversial for some, be interested to hear. I think we also need to distill the feedback in a way that can be heard in action, which means going deeper on operational challenges. That beyond the sentiment that you talked about too, that we're measuring, we're actually making sure we collect the employee information around what's slowing them down, what's tying their hands, and we are presenting it in a way back that can be heard. So my observation will be, we can do lots of training for leaders and for all of us on how not to be defensive and how to be open to input, but it's challenging, right? And it is absolutely a barrier. But we take the inputs, we're in a focus group and we hear, our leaders are never there for us, they don't care, right? And we turn that into to feed back to the leaders, and we don't want to water down what the feedback is. We want to make sure it's in a way that can be heard and actioned. The employees are looking for more support. They're looking for more of a presence from you. They're looking for support, actually learning how to do this manually, right? That we want to be able to both get into those insights and present them in a way. And while we may not always have the capacity to do this, I would suggest it absolutely supports efficiency and ensuring that employees' needs are addressed.
Great. So I guess as you kind of wrapped up this section on kind of listening, there was a question that came up a little kind of midway through that I thought was relevant now. And it was, what strategies have you found effective in getting employee voice when geographic complexity is a barrier and a lack of technology exists?
Yeah, it is more challenging. More regular, shorter surveys, I find, are fine. What's important as well is that we're always feeding back. Here's what we heard. Here's what we're doing. To say, too, is employees don't have survey fatigue. They have a lack of action fatigue. So I think that's one critical component. But as well, making sure we have check-ins however way we can. So we've got some skip levels to overcome the leader, or whether they're over the phone or virtual, whether we run virtual focus groups. And I would say we've converted largely to virtual, well, entirely, right? Virtually the last number of months, my team. And we wouldn't have generally recommended virtual focus groups. We've done them when there was no opportunity or choice. But we have absolutely found there's ways to make them more effective. I'd be happy to have an offline conversation about that as well.
Cool. Now, when I read it, I said geographic technology, and then it was also a lack of technology exists. And what I've seen really work is having, call them voice or change champions in those regions to have those conversations, and then accountability for actually getting that group together to say, all right, for a greater purpose, are they similar pieces of feedback? Is it isolated to geography? But I find when you can get champions to support change, or really any initiative for that matter, I find those champions really, again, they're part of that process. They're involved, and there's a lot of value from a HROD lens, however you're making the change. But those champions are huge.
Yeah, that's a great call out, and particularly and most importantly too, that they're individuals who are viewed somewhat neutrally within the organization as well, so that the employees have a lot of trust that they can go to this person and they can share their feedback, and that this person is going to be a great filter for them that they can trust.
No, it's great point. Awesome. Thanks for the questions.
We talked about the units we saw that were at risk, and learned that in large measure, much of that was driven by leaders not owning the message, and would say that it was with all good intention, right? I know this sucks, we're in this together. But the challenge is employees don't actually see that leaders are in the same position as them. They view them as having more power and authority within the organization. And if they're feeling resigned, they're likely to feel even more depressed. And leaders don't always understand, and I really had to reflect even on my own practices when the data came in, right? Even certain messages I might distance myself from. You think about comp as an example. We might give ourselves, you're like, I don't control the budget, right? But you think of it telling an employee, I'd pay you $1,000 an hour I could, but this is beyond my pay grade, as opposed to, I hear you, and I hear your friend Susie across the road makes this much. I want to be honest with you, I'm not going to be in a position to match this year or next. What we do provide is this. What I feel great about is that. What's most important to me is, the difference you make. And your sense of humor when things go sideways makes all the difference. Which actually leaves the employee feeling better. So we both want to make sure leaders are aligned with the change. We talk about those key dimensions, right, to support change. They're aligned and they're able to speak to and feel ready to speak to it, that they're going to be supported as they go out and talk to employees. And that they understand that when they distance themselves from the message, they actually leave employees feeling alone. One common mistake, again, very well intentioned, see within communication strategies, is endeavoring to tell individuals to be, in some way, to be positive, right? To here's the bright side of this situation. And what we find is that when employees are told to think or feel about a situation, they tend to withdraw, and they're a whole lot less likely to share their candid input and concerns. And then their concerns fester, and then when their opinion does come out, it tends to be in a way that's a little bit harder to hear. There's a lot more emotion behind it. And what's interesting, I think, with our COVID reality right now, too, is I think we've seen that the individuals who tend to have the most credibility internationally right now are those who speak in a very authentic, candid way. They speak with empathy, but they're not sugarcoating messages. And we'll say that employees will take bad news a whole lot better than they'll take bad news dressed up as good news. I would say as well, too often we focus on here's why we're changing, important. We don't want people feeling like they're a piece of chess on a board. Here's why we're doing it. And then we spend too much time on here's why it's great, and here's why you're going to like it, or here's why the company needs this in order to thrive. But when changes are positioned as solely good for the company, they don't tend to land well. But more importantly, we need to spend a whole lot more time on here's what you may be concerned about. Is this going to reduce hours? Is this going to result in training? And we want to really take a good guess at here's the things that might be top of mind for you. Here's our suggested thoughts on how we can address these barriers. And with that start, we're creating a forum where employees are going to be much more comfortable identifying their concerns. I'm going to share a case study at a very high level, and would be happy to provide this to the detail to anyone who's interested. Worked with large organizations implementing a complicated change to many processes at once across different divisions, and they chose a unit to work with, and it was coincidental, that had lower engagement just based on the proximity to resources. And we supported them with implementing numerous avenues and ways of enabling leaders, of getting that candid feedback through different forums. And what was interesting was the lift overall of engagement within the organization. Well, we had this group that was significantly behind. And you would think throwing such a massive amount of change at them at once could further disengage them. But the fact that they were actively involved and included and had forums that really allowed them to actually make improvements and really help shift, what the tasks look like as opposed to the milestones look like. They actually had a larger lift in engagement, and at the end, we're ahead of the organization. Supporting employees who want to be available, responsive to concerns, provide structure during change. People can kind of go into fight or flight, right, or freeze. So we expect that we can't just say something once, right? We need to come back to it. Be clear about what is changing, we often get. What's also incredibly important is to talk about what's not changing. This is incredibly calming for people. I think even the most disruptive change, right? There's often something in there that's not changing. We're going to be the same team. We've got the same leader. Whatever you can identify that's not changing, it's incredibly calming. It gives people an anchor. And involve employees, as we talked about, as much as we can. Ideally, we're co-creating, but there's times where it's collaboration. And times we're looking for cooperation, but we built a ton of goodwill before we're asking for cooperation. Building a culture of agility, again, it comes back to that we're focused on that common purpose. So COVID gave us this common context, right? Everyone bought in. There was no debate about the fact, oh my goodness, we need to adapt quickly, and aligned on the key tasks around. We got to get this remote. We got to get this online. We've got to, and given that trust and authority to test and to feedback. Here's what worked. Here's what didn't. Here's how we need to adjust. How do we recreate that? What's with our passion, our purpose for the organization, making sure employees are connected, and then also ensuring they're supported. So we talk about getting into that detail and finding ways to collect that detail and making sure it's filtered in a way that can be actioned and addressed. Favorite quote of mine from Frances Heslin talks about that the culture reflects the realities of people working together every day. And I think too in units where I've seen that things are off the rails from a cultural perspective, where numerous complaints, potentially maybe numerous complaints from employee to employee, potentially harassment complaints or unprofessional complaints. We could look at it from a very top view, right? We can go out and talk about our principles around employee treatment. We could then bring it down a level and do some training around respect in the workplace. I agree, all these things are important, right? But I will say, I have yet to go into a unit where things are where there's a ton of friction and things people are bumping into each other, and not also seeing that there's a ton of operational frustrations that are actually antecedents to the level of conflict between employees. So again, just to come back to, where I encourage us to go deep where we need to. But that's why we have our leading indicators, right? So we're not going deep everywhere all the time. We have forums where we're surfacing employee sentiment. We're keeping in tune with it. So we identify where we need to go deep and when. How do we ensure our teams are connected to the company's purpose and customers' expectations, that we're sharing more data and dashboards, we're democratizing access to this information so people can participate, they can experiment in real time. Oh, I see that we're losing clients at this part of the sales process or at this phase, right? Let's try this team. Consistently listening and adapting to our customers' demands, invested in remaining current on innovations related to your business, and comfortable sharing diverse ideas and perspectives. And we'll just add, I think the real game, when we think about democratizing access to information, I know it can be a bit of a journey for organizations, but we think about the power of not having to have one group of employees that has to come up with all the great ideas, right? And the power of democratizing the opportunity to contribute across the organization. Continuous listening for change, insights from all impacted employees. We're testing before we're changing, and before our implementations too far along, where people ask, like, well, really at this point, you're just asking us how we should decorate the windows, right? For me to provide input to me would mean that you're pulling out everything that you've just installed, including in problem solving, focus and agility around purpose and goals. We're defining what success looks like. We're aligning on what our objectives are, and that meaningful participation, that we're treating employees as trusted advisors. So we can carry on that incredible feeling that many of us have had over the last number of months of just how proud we are of our team, and allow them to be proud contributors as well.
It's funny, one of the frustrations I have when organizations try to kind of put their back up against the wall in terms of doing more continuous listening or getting more frequent, or whether it is through for just generically or through a major change, is they're like, well, it's going to be too much effort, or, you know, it's just going to be too much pain and we're going to have to act on it. But the reality is that the companies that don't do it very frequent, there's no accountability to act, right? Because no one's getting checked in, and there's no accountability for anyone to do anything different. And it's harder to understand the impact of your change, right? If you're waiting to the end, I love what you said about, let's not just celebrate the implementation, let's celebrate the post-implementation. There's so much that happens in that time frame that you continue to understand what's working and what isn't in order for you to navigate your way to success. I always say every good change, you might get 90% there, and that's like 100%. You got to figure out the last part of it. But again, that concept about, you know, the focus and agility, it can't just be a moment in time when it comes to listening. And that's why I see a lot of companies fail.
It's a great comment and context. So welcome to dialogue we've got going in the chat today. Yeah,
so there's a number of questions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of stop sharing our screen so people can see us. And basically, so there's a couple of questions, and they're all really good ones. So I'll kind of go in the order that they came in, unless you know, one of them pops up that makes sense. But one question was, what role can direct managers play when helping to receive and give feedback on larger organizational initiatives and practices? And it goes on to say, what competencies do managers need to develop to support change management and help gather ideas from their team? And kind of last one, I might have to repeat a couple of these, apologies. Do you recommend that managers help in these types of tasks? So hopefully you have some thoughts around that.
Yeah, and I'm happy to be redirected if I don't hit all the points there. What I've actually found is that engaging them and actively responding to their team's input is the most incredible development that they can have. And that actually ends up, and hey, we deliver courses in leadership and training, and I'm not undermining, you know, how effective those could be and helpful those can be. But I found the biggest lift has come from leaders. We collect feedback at broad levels of the organization, but always recommend we then come back and put at each level, put the feedback in front of the one-up leader and put them in a room with one model, right? Put them in a room and ask them to make the recommendation. And what I've consistently seen, especially when we're working with leaders who aren't used to being tapped, is that they clam up for a while, right? This is beyond my pay grade. But once they get going, they have incredible insights. Coach and help them on how to present their recommendations up. And we accomplish a few things. It increases their business acumen because they realize that when they make a true recommendation, they can't just say, give everything to this or everything on this. They've got to be quite balanced in what their recommendations are. They build their confidence and ability to make recommendations, and they're a whole lot less likely to distance themselves from messages back to employees and not on the message because they've seen the impact their recommendations can make. So the skills around active listening, I find, again, can be developed real time. Yes, we can run training programs. I think those are important, problem solving, business acumen, but have absolutely found that really putting them in the situation where they're required to take in the feedback and come up with recommendations and solutions has developed them the most. And I've seen units where we've gone in, where it makes sense to do a big, deeper intervention, right? Things have been quite off the rails. And seeing units that have gone from being, quite fledgling and leaders who weren't confident and weren't as skilled as responding and presenting back to employees become incredibly adept at doing so.
Right. And one thing that really caught me there was what competencies do managers need to develop or support change? And one that I've seen a lot of organizations investing time and effort and dollars in, and I think it's a good one, is, I don't know whether you want to call it a competency or not, but just the concept of empathy. Like, think about it, especially at this time, people are getting attacked at every layer of their personal wellness and financial wellness. And even just the uncertainty of what's happening around you, and just that ability to really hear people and do what they can to kind of understand the situation. I felt has been really beneficial in this world, and leaders, right? They're the ones having the conversations with employees every day. It's not just the executives. So I found that as a really interesting kind of competency. I've never heard it as a competency, but 2020 might be the year.
No, that's great. And we think about too, because often, again, they've had more time to adapt. So they're a bit fatigued by the change. Like, don't you get why this is important? Because they've gone through the whole change management process. So absolutely, it's a competency that we need to help them develop.
Wonderful. I guess on the same leadership train, actually maybe a little different. I'll just kind of read the question out. So how do you manage up? And it says getting managers, specifically senior management or C-suite, to adhere to the changes that are being implemented, meaning the processes, policies, standards that are put in place. Any thoughts, Pauline, on that?
Yeah, I think too, it goes back to having, think about courageous listening, right? Where we want to go really deep and understand what the barriers to them are. And when we try to talk somebody into thinking something or believing something, it doesn't go well. And there's research to show that when somebody's repeating themselves, that it tends to be a sign they haven't actually felt heard, right? So they're stuck on this same, like, what, don't you get it? Like, isn't it obvious, right? We need to do this, but here's why. But we can actually help them get off that train with some deep listening. And I wouldn't even try to convert them in that meeting often, right? Then we come back to them, like, we had some time, revisit what their barriers are. Often they will come to it then themselves, or at least the reality that we need to move forward. So that would be my first step. But as far as, if we're looking at certain groups and divisions and leaders, we also want to consider their background, their perspective, what resonates with them more. Is it more the numbers, the metrics, right? Like, what is it that influences them most? What do they need to feel comfortable moving forward with the change? And really, that should all be in our arsenal.
Yeah. As soon as I see something like how do you manage up, my thought goes speak in value. And what that means is, like, what's valuable to that leader, like the financial element of it is, not the same as one leader. That might be about the employee experience. And sometimes you have to kind of play to the audience, so to speak.
Mm-hmm.
Great. Thanks for that. So another one, interesting question, actually. Basically says, do you find that employee festering is better or worse right now since water cooler talk no longer happens in person?
I will say we've seen a mix, which maybe isn't what you wanted to hear as far as, not one common theme on this. In many cases, we've seen actually cooperation increase. And that because we're also being more thoughtful about when we interrupt somebody too. When we're in the office, it's very easy to drop by somebody and interrupt them with our quick question. And I think we're being a bit more planful, but also more thoughtful about who we need to engage and how. But it really does the culture does matter, right? The expectation around consulting with our teams. And research actually shows this with remote work too, is employees tend to be happier with the amount of contact they have with their boss. Once a week tends to be good for them. But what can get lost is that connectivity with team members and the connection to the organization. So in a more remote workplace, we want to make sure we build in the structures that really enable those ad hoc conversations.
Yeah. There's not water coolers anymore, but there's Slack groups and private Teams groups and all those other things where a lot of those conversations happen. So I think it's probably the same. But yeah, that interruption kind of point you bring up is pretty interesting. Great, and I appreciate that question that came in. There's another one, I think it gets back to some of the discussions around empathy, but I love that it quoted Maya Angelou. They may not remember what you said, but they will remember how you made them feel. What are your thoughts or experiences in having leaders understand this is core to leading people through change?
Yeah, it's another favorite quote, love to embed in training. Also, like to talk about, I can guarantee you that your team, their family, all knows you by your first name, right? So that you are a discussion point at the dinner table, that you have the largest impact on what their employee experience is. And also making sure that they understand, again, the importance of owning the message. And what I do want to share too quickly is that what I've seen is when they understand that they actually leave employees feeling worse, they do change their style, but they need a whole lot more support in the interim. So he says once they wrap their head around that concept, they're going to ask a ton more questions about, why are we doing this? Like, I'm not buying it. How am I going to speak to this if I can't buy it?
Great. Yeah, it's funny. I've seen, and you might throw kind of empathy into this world, but just the concept of psychological safety and having people understand people's flight or, kind of fly reaction when it comes to hearing something. I love what you said about talking about what's not changing. Like, I think that's a really good way to say, listen, like this world's not changing. By the way, what's important to you? So I think it's more important than ever, but a lot of companies have tapped in, especially the leadership, to say, understand when you're having that conversation, not just being empathetic, but what goes through people's minds when they hear something that is going to personally influence them. And again, I think now more than ever has become more relevant, that's for sure.
Yeah, and table stakes, I think, to talk about, right? You don't get to be the grumpy guy, gal, until you've had your 10 o'clock coffee. Like, you are responsible for people, and you need to be responsive to them.
Awesome. Cool. A couple of more questions here. Some great ones. Thanks, everyone, for your participation. This one says, what can we do when employees tell us that we have lost that trust in some capacity, or they feel like they're no longer trusted advisors? Is there something that's most important?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing, and I would say whenever sentiment is off the rails, right? The biggest thing is to show humility. Thank you for letting me know that. I want you to feel that you can come to me, come to us. I want to hear what's on your mind, and to make sure we make it very comfortable for them to share what's driving this, what the antecedents are, and we work deeply and quickly to address that.
Yeah, it's funny. I read this somewhere and I can never find who said it, but it's like, when it comes to trust, you're either building it or eroding it. Like, there's no like purgatory of trust, or there's no middle ground. And I found if you ask yourself, are we building trust, and you're not, you're probably in the situation that this question is asking. The other one, I think that humility, like I have personally in my time, leadership and organization, literally sent cards to everyone. It's like, we effed up. Like, it was just the ability of saying, listen, we are okay being vulnerable and telling you what we did wrong. But the level of trust that continues to build, if you get to that point, you kind of get to a better playing level, or level playing field of them, hey, we get it. We realize it was wrong. We realize we haven't done you right. And then start moving on from there. So I find that there's a pivotal moment of that humility that's involved in order for you to kind of turn the sails on the ship, so to speak. Yeah,
that's so important. You said that so eloquently. And to written scripts for people, right? It's just as far as making sure that the fact that you're feeling this way means we let you down.
Yeah.
And people are very, it has to be genuine, right? But sometimes people do need, it's a skill to learn how to express your empathy as well. But people are very forgiving when it's genuine. And when you come back and say, you know what, I'm sorry about this. I've seen divisions too, where it's, hey, I've received some feedback that people here are not feeling supported and feel like I've been too aggressive in how I'm pushing objectives. I'm committed to turning this around with you. I'm grateful to know how you feel. People will give room. But as you said, they're going to be working on the rebuilding.
Cool. All All right, a couple of minutes and one last question popped in, so why not? Let's just answer it. So would you have any recommendations to incorporating these types of activities into a government setting where you're faced with a lot of legacy procedures and policies and where public servants typically are resistant to change?
Yeah, and I'm happy to have, so we're at 1 minute, happy to have an offline conversation as well. I mean, I think it's, and I started my career in the government, so I can immediately empathize with the perspective as well. I'll share. It really is, it's the same practices in large measure. It's a whole lot more sympathy. I found, I think actually my early days in the government actually prepared me well for my negotiating work later in my career, because I found that I needed to negotiate with large groups of stakeholders at each level before I presented recommendations to move forward. I needed to do a ton more work to make sure we had a shared context, shared understanding of a need to move forward, and buy-in in order to be effective. And a whole lot more patience than comes to me naturally, I will confess.
Yeah, awesome. Yeah, one thing that comes to mind for me is that your recommendations of incorporating these activities, like people thought that you couldn't do a remote work strategy and it would take 3 years. And companies have proven they can do it in a much shorter time. So I think there's a lot of confidence now in recommendations of look what we can accomplish if there's aligned vision and all the things you talked about, Pauline. So I think, I mean, I've worked with some large municipalities today that are doing things, especially from a continuous listing perspective, they've never done before, but they've got that buy-in, I think, with that kind of confidence that team has in them now. But definitely different legacy procedures to navigate through, that's for sure.
I like your call out on some feel that we don't have time for this, but it actually is a lot more efficient.
Yeah. Perfect. Well, we're up to the hour. That seemed to be like perfect timing in terms. We never get through all the questions, but it was so great to be able to have some good interaction. Pauline giving us time to have that. Thank you. A big thank you for everyone that joined and participated. Love the WorkTango community, and we continue to do these to help. We're also waving the same flag, right? How do we build a better employee experience? And a big, huge thank you to Pauline for investing your time and effort. We know you're busy and an organization to run and clients to work with, but very thankful for your time and your insight today. I found it valuable and some good takeaways as well. So really, really appreciate it.
Thank you for the discussion.
Awesome. Well, everyone have a good rest of the day today, wherever you are, and take care.